Grab your beverages and turn up your interweb. Solving the world's problems 12 ounces at a time. It's Dudes and Beer. Regarding everything that's been going on. So here we are, episode 193, the government mind control technology confirmed with Dr. John Hall. Dr. Hall, how have you been doing?
Hey, how have you guys been?
Doing great.
Doing great, John. Doing great.
It's been a wild ride since the last time you were on. Shortly after the last time you were on, I made the report to our audience that my LinkedIn was being watched, which, of course, if you're on LinkedIn, I know you're on LinkedIn, Dr. Hall. If you're on LinkedIn, you actually get a report like every week. Hey, you appeared in this many searches. And it was right after we had Dr. Hall on, then we spoke with Radical Empathy Foundation. We talked with Raul Diego about the drug war.
Right.
And then we did an episode on the Vegas shooting.
Yeah.
And right after those 4 episodes, I popped up on the radar with 72 hits that week in LinkedIn, 32 of which came from the Department of Defense, and another like 15 or 20 or so came from employees of the CIA.
DOD.
So it was very interesting to me, and those regularly pop up in my feed now whenever I see that, because we're talking about stuff like this. We are talking about declassified government programs like Project Stargate, things like that.
And they probably like listening to their own stuff, too.
Well, I mean, there's no better source for how well things are doing than media. They're going to tell you how well things are doing.
Right.
So we were more than happy to contact Dr. John Hall. He was obliging to come on tonight to talk about this report that came out in April these leaked documents and exactly how they connect to so many stories that have been going on in the news over the last many years, from mass shootings all the way to the harassment of our embassies in Cuba and China.
Well, and the harassment of media personnel that are actually labeled conspiracy theorists and actually trying to bring the truth. You know, I don't know if you saw recently, but, you know, someone we know was kicked off Twitter.
Yes.
And kicked off of his platform. But now there was actually a right-wing conservative host kicked off Twitter out in the Houston area that I believe is a former congressman that had kind of a conservative radio show, and Twitter kicked him off too. So it's one of those things where if you're not towing the political agenda, you're pretty much not going to have a platform much anymore.
Yeah.
But yeah, I did look at I saw that story come out in April about the accidental sending of those files to Muckrock, and found that pretty interesting because those diagrams actually came from a court case that was John St. Clair Ackley's case against the NSA. And I don't remember the year. It's been a while, and I did speak to him before I wrote my first book many years ago. But he had been, as I recall, an employee of the NSA and collected a lot of this data and a lot of these images and actually tried to bring forth a case. I believe it was dropped before it ever made it to court. I contacted him. Yeah, and when I contacted him, he was more than willing to talk to me once, but basically said that he had kind of gone on with his life and was basically trying to live as normal a life as he could and really didn't want to open that Pandora's box again. So he definitely was kind of scared off by his former employer.
Well, yeah, and his suit that was brought forth actually claimed that the NSA had and I quote, the ability to assassinate U.S. citizens covertly or run covert psychological control operations to cause subjects to be diagnosed with ill mental health. And documenting their methods at the same time.
And the frequencies used to specifically do those different things and target those different areas. Mm-hmm. And anybody that doesn't believe that, if you remember, Jesse Ventura did a show called Conspiracy Theory for a while, and a bunch of my friends are on it. I actually helped produce one of the episodes. And Fred Bell was a really good friend of mine, owned Pyridine Industries, and had done a lot of work with the government and sold them a lot of the software and hardware that they used to create some of these weapons, and then came out against it. And Fred was someone that I talked to almost every night. And even though I'm in Texas and he's in California, convinced him to go on this conspiracy show with Jesse Ventura. And I don't know if you remember the story, but he had called me the night before he interviewed with Jesse and said, my handlers are not going to like this, but it's for the betterment of humanity. People need to know. They may not believe, but they need to at least hear and know that these weapons exist. Mm-hmm. And 48 hours after his interview with Jesse Ventura, he was found dead of a heart attack in his hotel room.
Exactly. Yeah, I remember that.
And that is all too often the case. Be it whether it's people like American Made was made after, where they ran drugs for the government, or whether they're leakers who have leaked documents. We find, or UFO investigators in Eastern Europe that die from mysterious black oozes coming out of their orifice.
Oh, yeah. Max Spears.
It's just mind-numbing to me. Even lately, the case of the reporter and the Saudi prince, where apparently he was chopped up into bits.
Right.
And what I guess, as he claimed in the lawsuit, they have covert means by which to assassinate people. What are some of the ways that we can electronically, I guess, either haze or control somebody? Let's start getting into a little bit of the science here, Doctor, because you're actually an anesthesiologist by day, so you know quite a bit of how the brain works on numerous drugs, the way that dissociatives work, that kind of stuff. But the things that are happening here with people that claim electronic harassment are totally different from that, correct?
Yeah, in a way. I mean, one way to look at it is, old school. If you go back to MK Ultra, they tested every plant toxin, every hallucinogenic, every street drug, and LSD, anything that could scopolamine, anything that they figured could cause a psychotropic effect, they researched. Mm-hmm. And one way to look at it, the way we look at neuromodulation, is instead of dosing a drug, you're dosing electricity. And with electromagnetic weapons, instead of dosing a drug, you're dosing frequency. And, specific frequencies targeted to specific areas of the brain will give you specific disorders, or symptoms that you're looking for. And one way to look at it for the lay listener that's new to this is, an agency may have a catalog of EEG waveforms that correspond to depression, one that corresponds to anger, one that corresponds to your hands going numb, one that corresponds to your legs getting weak, so on and so on. And if you entrain that specific EEG or brainwave waveform into another human, eventually your brain will entrain that waveform and you'll display those symptoms, because the brain controls everything. All your cranial nerves come out of the brain, the spinal cord comes out of the brain. Ultimately, every function in your body is controlled either consciously or subconsciously or unconsciously by the brain. So if you stimulate the right areas, then you can Broca's area to control speech. You've got auditory centers and visual centers, and that's actually where they monitor and stimulate to do a lot of this. And I think you, on one of your documents, you talked about the Monroe Institute and some of the work they had done with binaural beats, and that's one form of entrainment that can be both used for bad or used for good. And that is one of the ways that that we recommend targeted individuals actually overcome some of their targeting is through binaural beat use. But if you look at the history, government history of controlling another human being, they've left no stone unturned. I mean, the early studies, they studied behavior, child behavior, male-female interaction, male-male interaction, female-female interaction, animal-human interaction. I mean, behavior in groups, behaviors under stress, behavior in love, behavior on drugs. I mean, it was exhaustive studies. And these are studies that were, a lot of them, done non-consensually through MKUltra. And all of that's available through Freedom of Information for people who don't believe it.
It's also available on the Dudes and Beer Knowledge Vault, dudesandbeer.com/knowledge, everybody. Go there and check out the declassified section, and that's where you'll find all the documents linked in today's episode post.
Oh, yeah.
So a little bit, just to kind of backtrack for a minute, you've thrown the term entrainment out a couple times, and I know we've discussed it in your past appearances, but I'd like to kind of go over the Monroe Institute's Hemisynch process just real quick, just kind of glaze over the first page here. I've highlighted a few parts that really kind of explain the concept of entrainment, and I'd like to introduce some of our audience to this concept that may not be familiar with the idea of binaural beats, using them for therapy, healing, PTSD help, all kinds of stuff binaural beats can be used for. But here is the actual science behind it, folks. Hemisynch is a patented auditory guidance system which is said to employ the use of sound pulse to induce a frequency-following response in the human brain. It is important that the Hemisynch process to report that the Hemisynch process can heighten selected awareness and performance while creating a relaxed state. Hemisynch is more than this, however, and an extended evaluation is warranted. It involves the physics of resonant entrainment, brain waves and their relationship to the behavioral psychology of consciousness and the physiology of the brain. And from there it goes into the 3 rules that are necessary. The first rule is that for one oscillating system to be capable of entraining another, the second system must be capable of achieving the same vibratory rate or oscillating frequency as the parent frequency. So basically, if your radio transceiver or radio receiver can't pick up 107.5, you're not going to hear station 107.5, folks. That's just how it works.
Right.
So as long as it's a frequency that your brain can pick up, your brain can be entrained. Is basically what they're saying. Now, the second rule involves power, and that rule is that for one oscillating system to be capable of entraining another, the first must have sufficient power to overcome the homeostasis of the second. So that means, like, in a resting state, without excitation, the power of the first wave that's trying to control you has to be powerful enough to activate your brain. It has to be powerful enough to overcome your resting state of your brain. And the third rule is consistency. For one oscillating system to be capable of entraining the first must be at a constant or fixed frequency. And it gives the example of a tuning fork. A tuning fork, if you bang it right there, that was a 128 hertz C-tone tuning fork, folks, for nervous and sensory tests. If I was to take that tuning fork and bring it in the proximity of another 128 tuned tuning fork,
cancels out.
No. The other one would start to vibrate.
Oh, I see.
Without me moving it, without me striking it with a mallet or anything like that, just being in the proximity of that frequency and of the power of that frequency that's greater than the power of it in its resting state, it would start to vibrate. Your brain does the exact same thing.
Yeah.
And
makes perfect sense.
It's really, I mean, these are pretty basic principles of physics. Am I right, Doctor?
Yeah, and then what they did is took those basic principles, and that's a good explanation. And then if you look at some of Malik's research early on, one of the ways they deduced to monitor pilots for hallucination was actually to shoot two dissimilar frequencies into the brain, because the hemispheres of the brain will actually entrain frequencies separately or wholly. Yes. Which means you can shoot one frequency into the head as a whole, and both hemispheres will actually entrain the same frequency, or you can shoot two dissimilar frequencies into the brain, and one hemisphere will entrain one frequency and one hemisphere the other. Well, when you have two dissimilar frequencies being entrained, which is the way you monitor someone or heterodyne someone, and we'll get into that in a minute, but the two opposing frequencies will actually generate an interference frequency in the brain, and your brain will actually transmit that back out. And the baseline EEG can actually be derived from that interference frequency. And it was a guy named Malik who postulated this, I think in 72, that to monitor pilots, you could shoot these two dissimilar frequencies into the brain. The brain will create an interference frequency, transmit the interference frequency, which can be received, and then turn back into their baseline EEG to monitor a fighter pilot after doing a 48-hour sortie as to see where they're having hallucinations or if they're showing fatigue, and then zap that pilot back into conscious state if they're falling asleep in the cockpit or having delusions in the cockpit. Now, that was the reason for the study, but unfortunately, the other things that got gleaned out of that is, hey, we can monitor the EEG remotely. We don't have to put leads on the skull. And once you pick up that EEG waveform, the baseline that's decoded out of the interference frequency, then it can be heterodyned or altered to demonstrate one of these states that you want to put that individual in, shoot it back at the head, cause that signal to be entrained, and then have the person actually demonstrate that symptom. Like, let's say you want gun control and you want someone to go run amok with a gun shooting people. Well, what you do is you pump voices into their head telling them that they need to do this, or they're on a mission from the government, and you fool them into thinking that they've got some kind of a prophet or a higher deity talking to them, and then you entrain them with a brainwave entrainment program to actually put them in an angry enough or a depressed enough state to actually do it. And we've seen that with a number of these shooters. One we talked about off the air that came from Alaska that tried to go to the FBI, told him that he felt like his mind was being controlled, that someone was working on him and using this type of software. And, of course, they didn't keep him. They let him fly on down to Florida where he tried shooting up the airport.
Yeah.
So, and which was probably intentional. If he was already destined, or predetermined to be a programmed assassin, for the gun control issue, then certainly they wouldn't have arrested him and examined him. They would have let him go on his way, which they did.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, like we were saying before broadcast tonight, if you start going back, and it's a real simple Google search, folks. It does not take a whole lot to start seeing this stuff. Simply go to Google and type in "shooter hears voices in his head." And you'll start seeing some major headlines over the last few years, and then start thinking about other headlines that were just as big. And some of them that I ran down this evening, whenever I first popped in, just shooter hears voices in his head. Of course, the Navy Yard shooting popped up with Aaron Alexis. Micah Johnson, the Dallas police sniper from a few years ago, popped up. Nicholas Cruz, the Parkland High School shooter, popped up. Esteban Santiago popped up. He was the Florida airport shooter that Dr. John was just talking about. And then after a little bit more searching, I came up with Steve Paddock. Apparently, he was reported by his girlfriend writhing in pain in his bed, talking about burning sensations, things like that. And his brother was even like, something was wrong with him. He was not the same guy.
Right.
So that to me kind of brings that into play a little bit. But the other one that popped up was Tamerlan Tsarnaev, the older brother in the Boston bombing. Had complained about voices in his head for a long time, and Miriam Carey, which was one that I distinctly remember because I was on broadcast at the time. Miriam Carey, for those that don't remember, she was the young black mother that was shot outside of the White House after claiming that she had heard Obama talking to her in her head. Ooh. That Obama had been talking to her in her head and that she needed to get to President Obama. She tried ramming her way through a security checkpoint at the White House, and the Secret Service ended up shooting her.
Ooh.
And this was a fairly young woman. She was in her mid-20s.
Dang.
She was not an older lady. She was not somebody that would suffer from dementia, anything like that. If I'm not mistaken, single mother. And it's interesting how when you run down this list, now, of course, there are a couple of military people inside of there. Micah Johnson was, of course, former military. Aaron Alexis was active military.
There's some military connections to this stuff.
But even Tamerlan Tsarnaev was known to have attended bomb-making seminars in Chechnya.
Yeah, Chechnya, yeah. I knew about that.
With forged American documents.
Right.
They were Chechnyan documents, but they were forged by American government. Like they were actively contacted whenever he was caught by Russian military, and they were like, "Hey, what's your guy doing over here?" So it's interesting how some of these people have military connection, but some of them don't.
Right.
Some of them, like Miriam Carey, are just an average, ordinary, everyday person. And
the key to all these stories is, if you've noticed too, is they're spaced out. You don't have a shooting happening like that every other day. Yeah. They make sure that it's one a year, a couple a year. And then they right away, and the media is complicit with the government in this. The government wants this technology hidden. That's why they've gag ordered these embassy employees. But if you've noticed, the media immediately hops on the bandwagon, helping the government out, going, well, friends said that, that the shooter was hearing voices and was acting strange and obviously suffered from, severe mental illness, and that's the reason for the shooting. And in some of them, that may be the case. As a physician, I'm not going to sit here and say that delusional disorder and schizophrenia doesn't exist. Now,
sure.
In all fairness, most schizophrenics, most of them don't hear voices, and most of them don't have violent behavior. Actually, the mentally ill are more likely to be victims rather than victimize anyone else, and that's statistic fact.
Yeah.
But the thing that has always bothered me is, I think the major media actually, we know from watching CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News that to some extent they're complicit with either the DNC or the Republican Party, one or the other. They're both propaganda machines. And what I've noticed is with the major media is they will never cover one of these stories and say, you know what, this is the 20th shooter we've had that's hearing voices that has some kind of government connection. And maybe it's time we look into why they're hearing voices and is there something causing it rather than mental illness.
Right.
And they're not. As a matter of fact, even after it came to light about these victims in the embassy, immediately in Psychology Today, you had psychiatrists and psychologists coming out writing these apologetic papers saying, well, this is very obviously group delusional disorder, and sonic weapons won't do this, and electromagnetic weapons won't do this, and there's no invisible ray gun that none of us know about. Like suddenly a psychiatrist from Harvard is an expert on directed energy weapons. That's something they know absolutely nothing about, but are still saying there's no way it's a weapon system. It has got to be group delusional disorder. And that came out days after those people were actually listed in the press as being victimized by a sonic weapon, which was a misnomer to begin with.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that much like many cases, and I remember contacting you. I was in Florida whenever it happened, that the Chinese embassy was hit, and it was right after we'd discussed the Cuban embassy. And it was just one of those wow, they just came right out and said that they were hit with a sonic weapon attack. Mm-hmm. And it was the same thing initially out of Cuba, where that is what every headline in every magazine said.
Yep.
Well, and here's how the talking points changed on that whole story. So they break the story that all these embassy workers got sick and they were being evacuated. Then they said it was a sonic attack with a sonic weapon, and they released that little buzz sound that the press jumped on and go, and this is the buzzing cricket sound that sickened the embassy workers, and it's a sonic weapon. Well, then people like me and several other scientists came out and said, well, sonic weapons won't do that. Sonic weapons won't give you white matter damage that you're finding in these people, and sonic weapons, typically won't work through walls. They're line of sight. And it really can't be a sonic weapon. Well, then they changed the talking points to health attacks. Well, then we're just going to call them health attacks, and it's a, as of yet, undescribed weapon system. Well, then the Cubans, and probably with some help from the Americans, came out with what it may be is crosstalk between two different radio frequency-based surveillance systems causing some aberrant interference wave that, as of yet, has been determined that may be destructive to human nerve tissue.
That sounds far.
And actually, John Bolton alluded to that in a recent talk where they said that he wasn't going to put up with any preconceived idiotic notions of how these embassy workers were attacked, because that was actually one of the theories that came out. Well, then, I actually had contacted one of the researchers in Pennsylvania, actually seeing these people, and said, you know what, probably electromagnetic weapons. And actually, the evening that story broke was on another radio show, not yours, of course, but and told the guy at that time, and on this show, I said, this ain't going to be sonic weapons. They won't do this. It will end up being electromagnetic weapons or microwave-based weapons. Mm. And sure enough, University of Pennsylvania finally came out and said, well, from our best guess, it looks like these people are being victimized by some type of electromagnetic weapon or a microwave-based weapon. Mm-hmm. And immediately, Psychology Today and all of these psychological websites started coming out with, now they're just making up stories that it's some glorified, just as of yet, discovered space beam or space weapon that is attacking these people. Trust me, these weapons have been around since the 70s. They've been worked on for longer than that.
Right.
So, I mean, the government knows exactly what these people are being attacked with, and I don't know if they're hiding it from the doctors in Pennsylvania that are examining these victims or not, or if they're just seeing what they find out on their own. But I think it's awfully odd that this late in the day after those attacks, that these people still have gag orders on them and they don't want them going public.
Yeah. And let me just run down one of the documents that was in the zip file that was sent to Muckraker describes psychoelectronic weapon effects, and it pinpoints certain parts of the body leading to text, and up around the cranium area it shows forced memory blanking and induced erroneous actions, induced changes to hearing, both apparent direction and volume, and sometimes even content. Sudden violent itching inside eyelids can be attained. Reading and broadcasting thoughts. We know that this is possible now. Well, there's only one way that Defense One could come out about a month and a half, 2 months ago, and say that we can now telepathically control drones. And when Defense One says that, that's like the white paper of the Pentagon. They're the ones that are like the press release of the new Pentagon stuff. So yeah, they were loud and proud in it that you could wear a ring on your head and control up to 3 drones with one pilot. So you can't really say that this technology doesn't exist when the military is coming right out and saying we can control objects with our minds.
Right.
And just to let you know, folks, radio waves go 2 ways. If you can control something, you can absolutely use a signal coming the other way to that and turn that transmitter into a transceiver rapidly. A few other things are controlled dreams, forced waking visions, transparent eyelids, it's called, where even when you close your eyes, you're seeing stuff. And then it highlights the middle of the body, and wildly racing heart without cause, remotely induced violent no rash itching, forced muscle quaking of the large muscles on the back, burning sensations. It goes. It highlights all kinds of different parts of the body, and for me, it's the fact that we know that these weapons exist. They've loud and prouded them, not just cases like that, but they've shown the footage of microwave weapons that they use, that they were using back in. And stuff? Oh yeah, exactly. The stuff that they were using to make troops give up without firing a shot. You know, all that kind of stuff back in the Gulf Wars. We've used this kind of technology for years. We even use psychological, just straight up psychological torture techniques that you use to like psychologically break people. In cases like Panama. Where we were getting Manuel Noriega out, and Nicaragua, WACO, things like that. Even Ruby Ridge, I believe they did the same thing. So the fact that there are known methods by which we can break the mind of people. That we can control the mind of people. We know we did the episode all of a few weeks ago with our psychedelic correspondent all about the history of LSD and the whole MK Ultra program, like the good doctor was talking about. What other programs have there been in place since, I guess, the official death of MK Ultra? There have been numerous other things that have come about.
One story you keyed on that I would like to elaborate on was the WACO debacle. And when Koresh was having the WACO thing, the FBI actually got a hold of it, that he was alive at the time. His name was Igor Smirnov, and Igor Smirnov was a Russian.
Yep.
And he was the one who actually first perfected the ability to actually project voices into the head where you would hear them as thoughts or as your own voices. By the way, that technology was sold to the Americans by his wife when he died.
Oh, wow.
And I forget the name of the company that first bought it, but it was purchased by us. And the reason the FBI brought him out to WACO was they wanted to use the voice of God weapon to put the voice of Charlton Heston in David Koresh's head as God to try to get him to surrender. And I mean, the reason they weren't able to do it is because at the time the Russian software was not compatible with the American FBI computers to do it. And for people who doubt that story, that was in Newsweek. So that actually broke in Newsweek not long after the whole Waco siege. So I mean, what I'm quoting is not something I'm theorizing or, something that I read on a conspiracy site. That's from Newsweek itself.
Yeah.
So, so that tells you how long this has been around. Waco's been a number of years back.
Yeah. Just a few, actually a lifetime ago almost, 30 years ago now. Right. To know that situations like that, situations like the mass shootings that we've quoted this evening, all of them that have been things that have brought up major questions about our vets. I remember right up around the time of Aaron Alexis was when the when the dialogue was heavily being pushed by DHS that returning vets were a lone wolf danger.
Exactly. That.
And that they may be radicalized whenever they get back.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, you start seeing all kinds of vets. And I guess as I was asking a minute ago, what are some of the other programs that have come about since MKUltra has ended that have kind of been a means by which to discover mind control technology and experiment with people?
Well, see, that's the interesting thing is technically MKUltra never ended. What ended was the release of Freedom of Information material. So, and I don't know, I'm sure you realize that the only reason we know anything about MKUltra, Dulles actually tried to shred most of those documents, but he wasn't able to shred the financial documents, and we were able to trace back where all of these sub-projects were funded, in which universities they were done through, and some private companies they were done through. But it really never ended. All it did was change monikers. Of course, there's, a lot of this is hearsay. You don't know for sure whether the monikers are right, but there's the Monarch program, a continuation of Bluebird, and a bunch of others. I mean, I would hate to guess on the monikers because I may not have them correct, but the research never stopped. The experimentation never stopped, and that's one of the issues that most of us as physicians that are dealing with some of these victims have, is the public doesn't realize there are no laws against the government experimenting on the public. It's the laws that we have, like a pharmaceutical company wants to bring a drug to market. There are laws. You have to have an institutional review board. You have to have lay people as well as scientists and clergy on a review board. You have to have consent for the people who are going to take these drugs in their phase 2 and phase 3 trials experimentally. There's a lot of that's why it costs billions of dollars to bring a new drug to market. Yeah. Now, when you have a black budgeted project through the CIA or the NSA or the DoD, there is no institutional review board that you know of. There's certainly a handful of people at the top that are looking at the data and calling the shots on who gets experimented on. But we know that from the studies on MKUltra and from the released information. These were front companies and that were created by the CIA, which is still creating front companies. Companies like NQTel, who actually invested in money in Facebook, which is Facebook by nature is a data mining tool.
Yep.
Now they have facial recognition and a bunch of other little tricks up their sleeve. That's how they're able to weed out content that they don't want being seen or don't want on Facebook. it was a way for the CIA to mine data from every human being that got given a free smartphone so they could be on Facebook, and have a tracking device on them at all times. Same thing they did with smart TVs. The reason they did away with regular, UHF transmission TV and forced everybody to have some type of cable.
No more analog.
And a smart TV. So,
my reasoning for the smart TV, at least in hypothesis, I try and avoid the term theory. I don't want anybody to construe me as a conspiracy theorist, but I will hypothesize on conspiracies all day long. That's the scientific method. Until we can get to the point of having to disprove it, it's not a theory, see? It's just a hypothesis.
I like how you do that.
And my hypothesis is straight up entrainment. As we were talking about earlier, your brain can lock into frequencies. There's a reason why your brain gets sleepy when it watches TV, and the idiot box takes over. 60 hertz. It's the flash rate of most lights, everything else. It's been shown through Russian experimentation that you can actually send monaural beats, not binaural beats, of course, but monaural beats, strobing through a light, where your eyes can't even see it, but your brain picks it up.
Right.
Your brain does not see the 30 frames per second that it takes for me to move my hand.
Right.
But that's right where your brain naturally sees. Now, your brain can't, like your eyes can't actually process 120 frames per second.
Ooh.
Like physically.
Right.
Your brain can do some processing on that level. But your eyes can't even physically see that many frames per second.
Right.
So, and it's been known for a long time. You can stimulate viewers' brains through TV.
Oh, yeah.
As a matter of fact, the Japanese did it. In the early '80s with a cartoon.
There were laws made against it here in America because people were putting flash frame ads inside of movies.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and actually they had an entire group of young children in Japan that were having seizures from watching one particular cartoon.
Yeah.
And they were unsure if it was being done intentionally, so they showed it again, and it happened a second time.
Yeah.
So I mean that they were certain about, and that probably was experimentation at its root too. And that's what people don't realize is that the government does experiment on the public. I mean, we did it with radiation. We floated radioactive clouds over New Mexico and Arizona to see how many people would get thyroid cancer. When they showed up at doctors' offices going, well, I think I'm getting thyroid cancer. Well, the doctors would say, well, sounds like mental illness. I mean, it was the same dialogue that you're seeing with directed energy weapons.
Yeah.
The Tuskegee, you showed up at the ER, oh, you're crazy. You don't have syphilis. You're fine.
Yeah.
We're not going to treat you.
You're crazy. You're not crazy.
Yeah. You showed up in New Mexico complaining of cancer. I'm losing weight. I think I must have cancer. I think they're floating radiation over us. Oh, that's crazy. You may have cancer, but they're not floating radiation. The Navy floated bacteria over California, Serratia, to see what kind of influenza they could call. The problem was they thought the Serratia was going to be relatively innocuous, but when it got into the atmosphere, it absorbed other bacteria and actually changed its DNA construct and actually became toxic. Yeah.
Oh man.
Yeah.
Bunch of idiots.
And
it wouldn't surprise me if the whole reason for the flu shot is because they're releasing a different weaponized strain of influenza every year, and they want to see who they can protect from it.
Right.
I think both ends of flu and flu shot are probably the same experiment.
Huh. Yeah, I'm not a big fan of flu shots. I can't remember the last time I took one.
Same here. And I'm all right.
I don't get the flu typically.
Yeah.
I don't get really sick. Like even for me to get,
I think I have better odds of
a sore
not
throat is rare
because I just don't know what is really going into my body.
Well, and to kind of backpedal for a second, Doc, some of the things that we're talking about are. Like I said earlier, fantastical to most people. in the realm of science fiction. Most people don't. I would say if you polled most people, you'd probably get about a 65% believe in hypnosis. And is it actually hypnosis, or is it just purely the power of suggestion, if you know what I mean? Is it the placebo effect? Are people actively being targeted by electronic weapons, or is it the case that they've read stories and now they've subconsciously picked up these effects? I guess it would be the easiest way to put it.
And I'll tell you what, for anyone that reads my book, Guinea Pigs, Technologies of Control, the first few chapters strictly deal with experiments done by the government on the public. And if you go to the reference section, you can reference every one of those. That's not something that was made up. It's all directly from the government itself. The Acre hearings Clinton held on the radiation exposure. Hillary Clinton had to apologize to Guatemalans for us experimenting on them with weaponized gonorrhea and syphilis, which was similar to the Tuskegee experiment. We had prisoners in L.A. that were experimented on with millimeter wave weapons without consent. And prisons, by the way, are a hotbed for experimentation. Orphanages used to be. Willowbrook School those kids were experimented on with different forms of hepatitis to help create a hepatitis vaccine. And it was an orphanage for, mentally retarded kids at the time, challenged kids that were orphaned, that had no advocates to protect them from it. So the military is a big breeding ground for experimentation, because once you sign your name on that line, you're really government property. You're not an individual anymore. The VA has been the subject of a lot of experimentation. So for anyone to believe that this is happening with directed energy and electromagnetic weapons, first you have to understand that it happens, period. And it has always happened. And that as technology has changed, well, now we're in an era where the weapons that we're using now to make somebody angry or control someone's mind or to harass someone is no longer something you have to bring someone into a lab and give them a drug or hook them up to a machine. It can all be done remotely.
Yeah. And that's exactly what I was saying earlier with the flash rates of televisions. If you're looking at a HD TV, you're looking at 128 flashes per second. That's 120 hertz, That's 4 times the number of subliminal messages that they can get into your head. That means 4 times as fast that your brain gets into that 30 hertz cycle of wanting to be asleep.
Wow.
So if you're talking entrainment, that means when you hear 30 hertz, your brain's going to tie into that 4 times faster than it normally would.
Jeez.
Well, and I think one thing that should bring around a lot of the people who maybe haven't heard about this or aren't sure if they really believe that this is possible are the Cuban diplomats and these couple from the Chinese embassy, because these are people that had good government jobs, were sent to Cuba on diplomatic missions, and all of them came out voicing these complaints. And it wasn't just government employees, by the way. There was several other civilians who actually came home and complained about this long before the embassy story broke. I spoke to one of them's physician. There was a guy that had gone there 3 or 4 years prior to the embassy story breaking and stayed in the hotel across the street from the embassy and came home describing the same symptoms. So it was happening before, and I know that, they're trying their best to blame it on the Cubans. I don't think it is the Cubans, but they've gag ordered these people. Well, one of the mother of the victim, Catherine Werner from China, has come out publicly because she feels that they're getting inadequate treatment, from the government, and that she feels that everyone's in danger from this technology, not just government workers, but certainly people in sensitive areas like embassies. And she wants the word out. So NBC Investigates actually did a big story from Laura Hughes, who is the girl's mother, who was victimized as well when she was in China with her daughter. And as a matter of fact, not only did she describe hearing the buzzing and all of that, but that they were lethargic, that you could feel pulsing or pressure in the room that was tiring and wearing you out. They got dogs, thinking that that they would needed guard dogs if they were unsafe. The dogs immediately started vomiting up blood, and showing signs of being attacked with something. So they both, got out and came back to the States, where her daughter hasn't become public because she's probably under a gag order, but the mother did come out on NBC Investigates. So there are people slowly coming forward with this. The Canadian diplomats that were victimized in Cuba actually came out with a lawyer in their own story this past week that they feel completely abandoned, that their country is not even subjecting them to the testing and stuff that's being done in Pennsylvania on our embassy workers, and that the only reason they even knew about the attacks, other than describing it themselves, is one of the American embassy workers contacted one of the Canadian embassy workers and said, well, we're getting attacked too, and our government's evacuating us. So it wasn't until they actually pleaded with their government to evacuate them that they even did it. So the big article recently was that they feel completely abandoned by both governments.
Wow.
Dude.
I hadn't heard about the at least not that far about the Canadians. And even speaking to you mentioned Pennsylvania. One of the points that I have written right underneath people hearing more voices than ever is worldwide reports of strange hum.
Oh yeah.
You hear about this in the news all the time. Look it up. Just look up strange hum. And guaranteed you will see a report somewhere near you, either in an adjoining state. Right. There are some states like Pennsylvania where this has been going on for a long time.
And New Mexico.
Yep, New Mexico is another. There are many parts of Texas. And, of course, back in the 80s, 90s, you always heard, the old joke about, they must live under power lines.
Right.
They're always hearing stuff, things like that.
Right.
But these are people that don't live near a power station.
Right.
And if you're attuned to that kind of stuff, if you walk near a power station, like there is a palpable, like you can feel it in your chest, the waves of energy.
Ooh,
kind of it's almost a magnetic feeling.
Yeah.
Whenever you walk near a huge power station, from just the radiative field of power. But when people are reporting just hearing a strange hum that comes and goes, it's there and then it's gone. Like it'll be there for a whole day. And these communities, like in Pennsylvania, New Mexico, how long have these things been being reported?
Well, I mean, for at least since the 80s. The first incident that I actually spoke to anyone who described accurately having voices placed in their head was two prisoners from the Utah prison system in 1982 were victims of experimentation there, where they were placed in a cell, and their description was that the electromagnetic intensity in the cell was such that it was hard for them to even get up off of their cots. And one of them reported that he was hearing voices in his head that were accurately responding to his thoughts back. And even he described it as telepathy. That he was being asked questions and the answers he was getting back in his head were responding appropriately to the thoughts he was thinking back to the questions.
Wow.
And he said it was very obviously an extraneous voice in his head, not his own thought, that it was something being transmitted into him. And these were a group of 5 prisoners that were locked in a room by themselves that all described this, and that was in 1982. Now, another interesting thing that's come to light recently, this for your listeners, target individuals, the group of people that, we think are being singled out for experimentation with these weapon systems and these surveillance systems by the government, most of them describe stalking. Most of them describe home break-ins, basically to rifle through your stuff and get information on you, not steal anything, along with the directed energy attacks like you described from the document that went to Muckraker. Or Muckrock, where, burning sensations, headaches, heart rate, increases and decreases, fatigue, everything you see with electromagnetic weapon exposure. An interesting thing is these Cuban diplomats that have been evacuated back to the United States, one of them did come out publicly and said that none of this has stopped since they got back to the United States. As a matter of fact, it worsened since they got back to the United States. They're still being attacked, and they're being stalked, and they're reporting home break-ins. So it went from being something that was, well, this is kind of similar to what we're seeing with the targeted individual crowd domestically that we have been seeing now for 20 years in the United States, to it's exactly the same as what we've been seeing with the people that have been coming forward here that, of course, are being written off as mentally ill. You know, the minute they step into a psychiatrist office and they say, well, here's what I looked up on the internet, I'm being followed, my house is being broken into, and these are the symptoms I'm experiencing. Well, almost 100% of the time they get a delusional disorder diagnosis, you know, regardless of how much data they bring in. Now, you know, warranted, some of these people may be delusional. I mean, some of them may have had mental illness, you know, all along. I mean, but being mentally ill doesn't preclude you from being attacked or experimented on. We know that from government history.
Yeah.
So now the question remains, were you crazy before? Have you been driven crazy? Are you crazy from being chronically attacked?
Right.
So, and the other thing, too, is you have a group of people that don't understand this technology, just like these diplomats don't understand it, doing their best to basically cope and doing their best to describe what's going on in their lives because they know it's criminal, and trying to get other people to understand it. And sometimes you try so hard that just trying to make someone understanding it makes you look crazy too. So, I mean, that's one of the problems that we've really had to fight with this, and the government knows that, you know, when you're attacking somebody to within inches of what they feel their lives, they feel like they're being murdered slowly, slow kill, torture, that, you know, eventually they're going to try so hard to get somebody to listen that just those attempts start to make you look mentally ill too. And they know that. So, I mean, it's every bit of this is geared to mimic mental illness. It was created that way. And that's why I think it's a matter of time till the government, the only two things they can blame this on with these embassy workers is they're going to have to admit that this technology exists. And if one industrialized nation has it, all of them do. So they might as well just come clean on it. That would be the smartest thing. Or they're going to have to call all these people delusional as well, just like they have the victims in the United States. Or they're going to have to blame it on aliens. I mean, really, that's the only three the only three options they have. So right now they've gag ordered all these people. They're trying to figure out which option is going to be the best.
Well, and just to put another hypothesis out there. You mentioned the last option there, or they'll have to blame aliens, and it's interesting because if you talk to abductees, if you read their histories, if you read their notes, read recovered memories, a lot of their descriptive experience of their abduction, things that they felt, things like that, marry very closely to the same symptoms as ultrasonic weapons, microwave weaponry, psychoelectronic weapons. And I at one point, before I had the pleasure of getting to know Kenneth Dudley as well as I do now, our UFO investigator for the show,
right,
I reached out to numerous people on LinkedIn that were connections, and one of them is a pretty high up broadcaster with connections in that realm. And I was like, I would love for you to come on my show and talk about the cases of soft disclosure that have been going on, like pretty much the Pentagon admitting, like, yeah, we've been chasing alien craft, or at least unidentified craft that are of extreme technology in our planes for the last many years. Here's the footage, and here's the bill.
Yeah.
And he was like, you know, quite honestly, with all the people like Max Spears dying mysteriously,
right, And he had some more stuff too,
Jim Mars even,
yeah.
As well as people like Richard C. Hoagland, who is a former NASA scientist, being like fully discredited.
Mm-hmm.
He was like, I'm loath to go on any shows anymore, and I'll tell you why. And at this point, we'd left the social media platform that we were chatting on and gotten into a personal conversation via text. And he was like, quite honestly, if I was to go back on broadcasts like I used to, I would really fear for my family's life. He was like, the sources I have that are high up tell me that one of two things are happening, and it's building to ultimately the same end. And that's means of control due to panic, due to, hey, we need control now. And the only way to do it is to give federales full control. And he was like, it will either be a staged invasion of aliens, or it's an actual invasion. But what's coming down the pipe that I hear from people all the time is it will affect into the hundreds of millions.
And that's actually been one of the theories of how they're picking. Is one of the questions we get is, well, how do they pick the people that they're experimenting on? And most of these people are, they are across the spectrum. So
yeah,
they're black, white, Hispanic, female, male. There's no gender preference, there's no religious preference, there's no sex preference. I mean, it is across the board. Well, one of the other theories is that if you're putting out a broadcast beam that's meant to control the majority of the public, and then you have a few stragglers or outliers that aren't responding to the control, well, then those are the people that are resistant, and that those are the people that need to be actually made to look delusional. So those would be the ones you start pumping voices into their head, have them do crazy stuff, or try to convince everybody that that there's control mechanisms in place, via electromagnetic weapons.
Yeah.
And then those people are discredited as Looney Tunes because they're not in confirmation or being conformed to the control. So, I mean, and that theory came out a long time ago that it's not completely random in the selection of the people being experimented on. Now, of course, the basic definition would be that, there's a random selection of people that are being experimented on that eventually, when 5G comes along and no one can escape electromagnetic waves, that will all be able to be controlled through it. But one of the other theories was that the targeted individuals basically are those that are resistant to electromagnetic control.
Yeah. And the final document in this leak actually shows 4 means by which people can be controlled electronically. One of them is ground-based towers. It shows, just like you were talking about, 5G. Shows some little towers with beams radiating out to the subjects. Another is it being mounted on a mobile platform, such as moving vehicles, cars, that kind of stuff. Moving weapons platforms. Another is remote and transportable within a domicile. So, like we were just saying, the Cuban embassy, the Chinese embassy, where more than likely it's coming from an adjacent building. And then the final one is via the black helicopter, via an aerial platform. So, quite obviously,
or satellite, yeah,
or satellite, exactly. And it even goes as far as to give the parts of the brain and the resonance frequency, like the motor control cortex is up around 10 hertz, audio cortex is 15, and just so y'all know, a hertz is a cycle per second. So imagine hearing a pulse tone every, what would that be, 60th of a second, I guess. Yeah. It's 10 pulses in a second, basically. And then, it's somatosensory, which is your sense of smell, sight, your thought center even can be invaded by this in the 20 hertz range. And motor impulse coordination, sound that bypasses the ears, so basically resonant frequencies where you were physically resonating the skull to get the voices to appear in somebody's head.
Ooh.
Or to even attack their brain with a noise.
Yeah.
If you remember, it was really popular probably about a decade ago now. The ultrasonic ringtone that kids had.
And for your listeners that don't think that voices can be placed in your head, they've experimented with multiple ways of doing that, and it can be done with ultrasound. It can be done with ultrasonic waves. Yep. It can be done with hypersonic waves, and it can be done with extremely low frequency waves, ELF. Yeah. And ELF has no shielding it. They're giant, long waveforms that actually go all the way through the Earth. That's why they use it for satellite communication. For submarine communication. Yeah. They can't be shielded, so there's no escaping ELF waves. They're everywhere. They happen with seismic activity, and they have a large influence on the brain. Yeah. And when I say ELF, I mean anywhere from 0 to 10 to 12 hertz type waves. And it's kind of odd that seismic activity, earthquakes, give off a lot of ELF when it happens. And consequently, there's a lot of UFO sightings typically around heavy seismic activity. Yeah. And one of the theories is that it's actually the ELF waves being generated by the Earth, their effects on the human brains that are around the seismic activity. And they actually experimented with remote viewing using ELF waves. They thought that ELF waves probably are the way that people have the ability to remote view. Russell Targ was one of the researchers there from Austin, and Harold Putoff, that did that research for the government on remote viewing. And one of the things that they actually researched, and the Russians agreed, that most remote viewing is people who can kind of tap into the Earth's ELF waveforms to be able to, see in their mind's eye remote places, and they could do it based on coordinates. So, I mean, this is not science fiction. It sounds like it, but it's been worked on extensively for a lot of years. Project
Stargate, we spent billions of dollars in this realm and still spend plenty of money researching it, folks. There are numerous books about it. The movie Men Who Stare at Goats was loosely based on some of the writings of people who took place in those experiments for Project Stargate. And they came up with some amazing results. They came up with repeatable results. Very, very interesting work in that realm. And it's interesting that you bring up... Go ahead.
The interesting thing with Targ and Putoff, though, is they set out to prove that it's not ELF wave based. And at the end of their study, they said, oh, no, we've conclusively concluded that it's not ELF wave based, that it's strictly, innate ability or lots of training to be able to focus, in the ether to be able to remote view. The Russians shook their heads and said, no, it's ELF-based, completely ELF-based, and it actually can be done through machines, which kind of makes me wonder if some of Stargate, either they were being disingenuous in their research, or they didn't know that those people, some of them, were probably being electronically augmented to be able to do what they did. So, I mean, that's just my take. So.
Very interesting.
Yeah, because it very well could have been the case that they were experimenting with the technology on other sides of the wall, things like that, while they were in session, to see what the difference was between sessions and study the effects.
And possibly experimenting on the experimenters.
Yes, exactly.
Because for the Russians to be so certain that it is ELF wave based, and then Putoff and Targ to come out and say, no, we studied it and it has nothing to do with ELF waves. Usually when you have industrialized nations, all achieving the same, kind of endpoints technologically, they're usually all pretty similar.
Yeah.
Not that diametrically opposed. Mm-hmm. And that's why, like with the embassy attacks, for the media to go along with the government saying, well, it's obviously the Cubans doing this. It ain't the Cubans. Even though the Cubans have a close relationship with Venezuela and a close relationship with Russia, I don't think that the government on that little Cuban island has been given this technology to use at random. And I don't think they would have came up with it on their own.
No. I'm not saying that they don't have a budget.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that they don't have military surplus,
right. Or it's impossible,
or access to Russian technology,
right.
Or even access to our technology, given the forward bases that CIA had, things like that there. So I discount none of that until it's proven otherwise. That's how my brain works, and what. I guess whenever you're talking about the work of Puthoff and Targ, Stargate, projects like that, and relating it to, like you were saying, ELF, that was the tag word that really came into people's minds during the Naval Yard shooting with Aaron Alexis. Of course, this is my ELF weapon, is what he carved on the side of his shotgun.
Right, he did, yeah.
And had complained about not only hearing voices but strange sounds, all kinds of things. What do we know about ELF weapons now?
We know that for one, you can't shield them. That's one of the reasons that they've really looked at weaponizing ELF. And one of the biggest researchers with that was Michael Persinger up at Laurentian in Canada. And he did a lot of the research for the Navy. A lot of the research was being done at the Navy Yard, which is why Aaron Alexis attacked the Navy Yard. That wasn't a crazy man going amok. That was a vengeance shooting.
Right.
They had actually attacked him in an airport, trying to get him to have that outburst in an airport, when they put voices in his head that sounded like some people that he was walking by were actually, cursing at him. And he did actually kind of start an altercation at the airport before he realized that, I'm being mind manipulated, that these people actually didn't say anything to me. He had figured that out, and he reached out to several people to find out what was going on, and mainly to figure out how to combat the sleep deprivation. They were keeping him up for weeks at a time without sleep to help drive him crazy.
Yep.
And he had a clearance. He had worked in a little bit of the technology area. He was a computer expert. So he knew what it was. I mean, in his contact with some of the outside world, he mentioned, I know this is ELF. I know I'm being targeted, being experimented on, and I feel like they're trying to make me have an outbreak, which he eventually did, but not where they intended. The intent was for him to actually have it at the airport. And if you remember, it wasn't long after that, his Navy Yard shooting, that we had the guy in California that had a shooting at that airport that was hearing voices, and we had the guy in Florida in the airport there that was hearing voices that had his shooting.
Yeah.
So I think he was one of three that was supposed to happen at an airport, and he managed to pull it together, and unfortunately went on a vengeance shooting at the Navy Yard where he perceived the targeting to be coming from.
Yeah. And through your work with targeted individuals, number one, let our audience know how long you've been working with targeted individuals, and what is probably the most revealing thing that you've found through your work. How did you come by your work? How did you actively get involved with this?
Well, I got involved after it actually happened to an ex-fiancé of mine who was victimized by a private investigative group operating out of San Antonio that's owned by a former FBI agent and his son, who's a retired DOD official. So, and we actually found them doing the stalking. She was hearing voices, and her place was being broken into, and was displaying bizarre behavior, came to me in, confidence and asked me if I believed this, what was going on. She was scared to go to any other doctor and mention it because she was afraid she'd be diagnosed as mentally ill, which is exactly what would have happened. This was a girl with no drug problems and, was, normal, wasn't a political activist. She showed apartments for a living. She was, nothing, no big thing, I guess you could say. And that's what a lot of these targeted individuals are confronted with. They said, well, why would somebody be spending all this money to target you? It's not like you're the president or the CEO of a big corporation. Well, that's exactly who you target. And if you look at the history of experimentation on the public in this country, they don't experiment on the aristocracy. They experiment on the common folk, the people who don't have any recourse, who don't have the money to hire lawyers, who don't have the political clout to go to Washington and have a hearing in Congress. So it is the common people that are experimented on, and whether that's social experimentation or directed energy experimentation. So that's actually what got me into writing the first book. And then it was such an overwhelming response to that book, and I just briefly touched on the technology that I thought, and I need to put a book out that just describes the technology that I luckily had the contacts within the CIA to talk to, agents that were still in the CIA at the time that were anonymously willing to be forthright with me about the capabilities of the technology at that time, which was 10 years ago now. The second book, I think, came out. In the second book that really goes into the technology is called Guinea Pigs, Technologies of Control. And since that time, again, including in the writing the first book and the writing the second book, interviewed just a ton of people that are experiencing this. And, admittedly, some of them seem a little crazy. Most of them aren't. Most of them are 30 to 40 years old, were living their lives just fine, can pinpoint the day that they noticed they were being stalked. They have police reports for their home break-ins where stuff was messed with, but nothing stolen. And they may not adequately describe how the technology works, but they adequately describe what they're being confronted with on a daily basis. So, and if you look at the same descriptions that are coming out of these embassy workers, it's exactly the same.
And with that in mind, talking about how we were saying earlier and how you were just describing, the main reason I had you tell your story again is because I've always found it fascinating that it wasn't a patient that came to you. It wasn't something along those lines. It was somebody that you actively knew.
More personal.
And that's what really drives it home, is the fact that this wasn't like, oh yeah, I did some consulting for the DoD for a while, or this came about through a patient or something like that. It was somebody that you actually knew, who, like you said, someone of, as far as the world politic goes, of no actual consequence, just your average everyday wakes up at 9, comes home at 5 person.
And there's no question that the groups that are actually have been given access to this technology are being allowed to use it. They have no fear of being caught. They know even if they are caught that nothing's going to happen. I mean, this was so obvious that there were times I was leaving her house at 1 or 2 in the morning and would have 3 cars that were parked next to me in the parking lot, 40 miles away at her house, follow me to my driveway 40 miles away at the country.
Gee.
Taking turns, one in front, one in back, one to the side, trying to intimidate me, or shooting bullets through my bedroom windows, or, anything they could do to basically keep me from helping her, and most importantly, keep me from publishing anything about it. So, I mean, it was a very concerted attempt, to stop these books from coming out. And of course, knowing full well that I'd be labeled a conspiracy theorist, when these books came out, which is probably a large reason that these victims have gag orders on them, is there's a handful of us physicians and PhDs that have written on this topic. And they certainly don't want those people talking to us. Another, for your listeners who want a good book to read besides mine on this topic, pick up Dr. Robert Duncan. He worked for the CIA, and he worked on some of this technology, has an excellent book out called Soul Catcher. And,
okay.
I mean, he's a physicist, so it's kind of it's not a layman's read by any means, but, you know, he is dead on the way the technology works, especially the entrainment part and the EEG heterodyning part.
Yeah, it's and like I said, it sounds like science fiction. It sounds like something utterly out of the movie Conspiracy Theory, but it is technology that actively exists. It is stuff that is out there. It is stuff that governments have been playing with, and like you were saying earlier, prisoners have been experimented on. We've been experimenting on people in America for hundreds of years. There's no reason that we would stop. There's absolutely none.
It just gets worse.
You know, and Doctor, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to once again come on, break this stuff down. I love having you on whenever these things pop up in the news.
Heck yeah.
Make sure to go on by and stop by Amazon. You can go to dudesandbeer.com, actually. In the episode post, the promo and the post for this episode, you can see the links for Dr. John Hall's books, Guinea Pigs, Technologies of Control, and A New Breed, Satellite Terrorism. So, Doctor, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me on again. Always a great time with you guys.
Absolutely.
All the time.
While you're online checking that stuff out, make sure to stop on by dudesandbeer.com. If you go by dudesandbeer.com/knowledge, you'll hit the knowledge vault. Go to declassified. Top of the list is this packet of information that we've been discussing tonight. Not just the leaked document that came to the reporter by accident at Muck Rock whenever he filed the Freedom of Information Act request, but also the great stuff from the Monroe Institute regarding the Hemisynch process that they have. And that's probably about a 20-page document that actually goes through the science of entrainment and how your brain works and how these processes work, where just a carrier signal nearby can cause your brain to glitch into effect and start doing what you have been programmed to do, or start programming you to do something. So once again, Doctor, please do hold the line. While you're online checking all that out, please do check out the HC Universal Network as well. I'm Chris Jordan, your host. Until next time, everybody, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and remember, if you can't be good, be good at it. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Dudes and Beer Podcast. To listen to our audio streams or chat with us live, download the official Dudes and Beer app for Android and iDevices, available on Google Play and iTunes markets. For more episodes, content, and information, visit us online at dudesandbeer.com. You can also find our episodes on Breach.tv, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, SoundCloud, iTunes, YouTube, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast service. Dudes and Beer is a proud member of the HC Universal Network family of podcasts. For more about our sponsors and other podcasts on this network, visit hcuniversalnetwork.com. Thanks for listening, everybody, and until next time, drink responsibly.